Hi everyone and welcome to a new video on the CBI channel. In this tutorial series we're creating a Django and React authentication / login system. This is not the first video in this series. In fact, we have already done 9 before, which range from a setup to focusing on registering and logging in users and much more than that. In the previous video we focused on protected routes, which means that if people don't have a token, they cannot access pages on our front end. In this video, we're going to continue on a little bit of a security in our front end, and we're going to add the tokens from our users to our API requests and make sure that users are redirected when they make a request with an invalid token. In this video, we're going to be focusing on 5 main steps. We're going to start by adding a list of users to our homepage on our React.js frontend, so we have an example to see how data goes from our backend to our frontend. Next, we're going to be changing the permissions in our backend to see the effect inside of our frontend. And we're going to be adding tokens to our API headers so we can authorize ourselves when making requests. Next, we're going to be creating logic for redirecting if the token is not valid or expired. And we're going to be testing the functionality in our React.js frontend. So we are now in our code, and the first thing that we want to do is we want to display some data from our backend on our homepage, so we can check how the data behaves when we change our API requests. And to do that, we first are going to go to our backend and we're going to create a new API, which is going to bring us a list of all of the users inside of our application, because it's the easiest way for us to just put something on our homepage. So we're going to go to users and then to our views.py file. And what we're actually going to do is create a new view set specifically for the users. And it's going to be exactly the same as our register view set. The only thing that we will change in the end is the permissions. And that's the reason that I'm not reusing this register view set, because we want people to always be able to access these pages. So we're going to go and copy over our register view set. And we're going to rename it to user view set. Now in here, for now, I'm going to let the permission class be equal to allow any, so that we can check what is going on in a minute. But later on, we will change it to see what happens when we only allow people who are authenticated to use this view set. Now the query set is going to remain the same because we still are interested in the user objects. And also our serializer class can remain the same because our register serializer actually has all of the fields that I want to display on my homepage. And we're going to change the def of create to a list, because I want to get a list of all of the different users that we have in our app. Then all that we need to do below it is we're going to redefine the query set, and I'm just going to copy that over from right there. And we're going to state that our serializer is going to be equal to self.serializer class. And then we're going to say query set and many is true, like this, because we want to get the data from our query set and there can be many records because it is a list. And then we're going to return that response so we can actually use it. And in that response, we will have the serializer.data, because in the end, we want to see that data inside of our front end. Now, this should provide us with a list of all of the users, and now all that we need is a URL where we can actually find it. So I'm going to copy over one of the roots in our urls.py file, and I'm going to call it users. And we're going to change this to the user view set that we've just created. And in here, I'm also going to set the name to users. And let's start our server to see if we can see this data now inside of our backend. So inside of our terminal, I'm going to cd into backend, and we're going to do venv/scripts/activate. And now we can do python manage.py run server. And let's check out in our browser what we can see. And if we now go into our browser, you can see that in our API root, we have users as a new entry. And when we click on users, we get a list of all of the IDs of our users and the email. So now let's make sure that we can also see this in our front end, and then we can go play around with our API to see how we can restrict the access to only people who have a validated token. So let's make a few changes to our front end to display the data. So we're going to go to the front end folder and then into the components folder, and we're going to make changes to our homepage. Now we'll start with a few imports, and the first one is import Axios instance from dot slash Axios instance, like this. And this is the API that is going to allow us to make the request. Next, we're going to import React, use effect, use memo, and also use state. And we're going to import that from React, like this. And then we're also going to import a box, which kind of functions as a div, from @mui/material. So now what we need to do is we need to first get the actual data, and then inside of our return statement, map that data so that we can actually see what's going on. So we're going to create a new constant, and I'm going to call that getData. And we're going to start off with 2 round brackets in there, and then we'll do an arrow function like this. And after that, we will have 2 squarely brackets to make our constant complete. Now in here, we're going to make the request using the Axios instance. And the Axios instance is the API call that we have defined right here. So we're going to do Axios instance, and then we're going to do .get. And in here, we need to specify the URL that we want to get. So we're going to do one of those reverse commas, and we're going to point our URL to the users extension. And we only supply the extension because our Axios instance right here already has the base URL. And if we go to our backend, you can see that indeed users/ is the endpoint for all of our users. Well, after we have gotten those users, we need to define what happens next. And we do that with a .then statement. And we're going to open up 2 squarely brackets. And the first one we say res, which basically means what are we going to do with the result. And after that, we add another arrow function with some squarely brackets. And in there, we can state what we want to do with the data that we actually get. Now, what I want to do is I want to store it in a state variable. So on the top here, we're going to define a new constant. And that constant is going to be called simply my data. And I want to change that by using set my data, like this. And we're going to make sure that that constant is equal to use state. And now we can use state or the set my data right here to update the data variable. So now we can say that after our Axios instance call, we can say that set my data is going to be equal to res.data. So we take the result, go to the data variable of it, and then we can put it inside of the my data variable by using set my data. And just to be sure, I'm also going to do a console.log so I can see what is happening in my console. And I'm also going to do that equal to res.data. And now we should be able to set the data correctly. Now we also need to define the use effect, because use effect is used to determine how often we re-render this get data request. Do we want to do that only the first time that we are on the page, or do we want to do that multiple times? So below the get data, I'm going to do use effect. And in there, we open 2 times the round brackets. And after this round bracket right here, we again go for the arrow function like this. And in here, we simply specify get data with 2 brackets right here, which is going to say that we want to execute the get data statement, which is going to get our data. And then after this squarely bracket right here, we can define an open square bracket list like this. And this makes sure that we only get the get data on the initial load on the page. So we now have that ready. Now in our return statement, we can map the data, or we can display the data that we are getting with the get data statement. And to do that, I'm going to create a separate div right here. And let's also close it like this. And in between this div, we can map over the data and return all of our users. So what I'm doing is I'm going to open some squarely brackets, and I'm going to say my data, which is equal to the variable right here where we place the data in. And then we can do a .map, which is going to iterate over all of the different data points that we have. And then we open 2 round brackets again. In this one, we define an item and index. And then after this, we can do another arrow function. And after our arrow function right here, we're going to do some set of round brackets. And in here, we can define what we want to do with this data. So in this case, I'm going to create a box for each of the entries that we have in my data. And I'm going to say that the key is going to be equal to index. And then we are going to say that inside of this box, I want to have two divs. Let's just do it like this. And one div is going to say that our ID is going to be equal to item.id, because that is one of the values that we get back from our API. And in the next box, we're going to say that the email of that user is going to be equal to item.email, because that is also provided in the response. And just to make it look a little bit better, I can do sx and then two squirrely brackets. And in there we can do some styling. And I'm going to set the padding to 2. I'm going to set the margin to 2. And let's separate those with a comma. And what we can also do is add some box shadow. And box shadow I'm going to set to 3. And this should make sure that we have a nice looking box. So what does this command actually do? It's going to map over the my data, where we put in the data from our API. And for each row inside of my data, it's going to create a box with a unique index from here. And it's going to display the ID based on the item.id, because we call our data item. And it's also going to provide us with the email address of that user by using item.email. Now, this is all very nice, but we're going to add one more thing, which you might also recognize from my previous React.js tutorials. And we're going to add a variable that determines whether our API is done with loading. What I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new constant, and that constant is called loading and set loading. And we're going to set that to use state. And in there, we say that it is true. So by default, when we land on this page, loading is still true. Then we're going to say, well, if this data has been passed to set my data, then we want to say that we are no longer loading the data. So after set my data, we can do set loading, and we can put that to false. Now in our return statement, we can say that we only want to display the content on our page if the data is not loading, because otherwise we will get the situation where we are still loading our data, but React already tries to map our data on our page, and that will cause an error. And that's something that we would not like to see. So on top of the screen, we simply are going to evaluate whether the data is still loading or not. So I'm going to say loading ? And if it is indeed loading, we're going to add a p tag like this, and it's just going to say loading data. And if it is not loading data, then it is going to show this entire code right here. And now we can just move that closing bracket to below here. And just like that, it is first going to complete the data loading before actually putting it on the screen, which will work nicely for us. So let's save this and also start our front-end server to check the results. And we do that by cding into our front-end and then doing npm run dev. And actually one of the small changes that I'm also going to make is I'm going to make sure that our protected routes are temporarily disabled, so that we can just see the content that we want to see, and we'll enable this later on. So I'm going to comment out the protected routes, and that way we should be able to see the right data inside of our code. Okay, and we're now back on our homepage, and you can see that we have nice boxes that are telling us what the ID is and the email address of the user. Now, currently in our backend, we have allow any on, which means that anyone can make this request and it will return these users. However, what we are going to do and what we need to do is we're going to go to our backend, and we're going to say that in our views, it is no longer going to be allow any, but we only want to display this data for people who are authenticated. And now when we return to our homepage and we reload the page, you will see that it keeps on getting stuck in the loading data part. Because right here, if we inspect it, you will see that we made an unauthorized request because we did not specify our token. So to counter the unauthorized error message that we are getting when we currently do our API request, we're going to make some changes to our Axios instance. Right now you can see that in our Axios instance file, we make a basic API request where we specify the base URL and we have a few headers with a content type and also accept. Now, when we work with tokens with Django Rest Knox, we actually need to add another header that is going to provide a token. And that token is going to serve as authorization to our backend because Django Rest Knox will check the token for validity. And if the token is valid, then it is going to provide us with the response. Now, this needs to work two ways because inside of our backend, inside of our views, you can see that when we do a login or whether we do a register, then we have permissions that allow any. So there, it doesn't matter whether we specify a token or not, it should still return a response. However, when we have permissions that is authenticated, that's when it's going to check the token and it needs to have a valid token before it's going to return a response. So in our Axios instance, we're going to extend the headers and make sure that we have something called authorization so that we can authorize ourselves when needed. Now, inside of the Django Rest Knox documentation, they actually specify what this needs to look like. So when you make an authentication request, it needs to have the authorization in the header, and the format needs to be the word token with a capital T, followed by the actual value of the token. So that's what we will be adding to our Axios instance. And the way that we are going to add it is by using an interceptor. And an interceptor is going to enable us to add some logic to our basic request. So below our basic request, we do Axios instance dot interceptors dot requests dot use, and actually needs to be request, not requests. And in there we open some round brackets. Now we are going to make some changes to the configuration. So we're going to do config, and after that we specify an arrow function and we do some squirrely brackets because we're going to change the configuration of the headers. Now the first thing what we want to establish is what our token is. So we're going to do constant token, and similarly to what we did in our protected routes, we're going to get the token by using local storage.getItem and then look for the word token. So we're also going to use that right here so we can evaluate what is inside of the token local storage at the moment of making the request. Then after we have established the token value, we're going to use that value to determine what we're going to add to our headers. So we're going to say here if token, so it's going to evaluate whether token is actually populated, and if the token is populated, we want to add that token to our headers by using authorization and then specifying the same structure as in the documentation. So in there we specify config.headers because we're going to configure the headers, and then we're going to add authorization, and that is going to be equal to the value of token and then the actual constant of token. Now to arrange that we need to use some backwards commas, similarly to when we make an API request, and we're going to write out the word token, do a space, and then we can add the value of the constant of token by doing a $sign and then some squirrely brackets where we say token. And this should make sure that we add authorization to our headers in the same format as in the documentation. Now it can also be the case that we do not have a token inside of our request, but we still want to add something to our authorization headers just for the sake of filling it up. Because otherwise when we make a login or a register request, it will throw an error because we did not do the config. So in that case, we're going to also do the same thing when we don't have a token, but we're not going to add that token. We're just going to leave it empty like this. And this is going to enable us to still make the requests when we log in or when we register, where we don't need a token, and still get the correct responses. Now, at the end of this nice statement, we are going to return config like this. And that will make sure that we actually configure it in the way that we should. Now, we're also going to add something for when an error occurs. So we're going to state if there is an error, then we're going to do a arrow function again with some squarely brackets, and we will return the promise or the response that reject, and we're going to return the error message so that if for some reason there is an error, we will also get to know it. So let's test whether this works inside of our browser. So we are now back inside of our browser in our front end, and you can see that we're still stuck on loading data because we currently don't have a token. And that is completely fine, because hopefully when we now go back to our login page and we log in using our credentials, we should be able to redirect to the home page, have a token, and then see the values of our users. So inside of the email field, we're going to do email@email.com, and we're going to do testing321 as our password, because that's the account that we've configured. And now when we click login, we should be redirected and still be able to make our request. And we should also, for the request on our home page, be using our token, which is valid, and therefore getting our users back. So let's see if that is the case. All right, and you see that we are now directed to our home page, and because we have our token, we have been able to make the request to our Django backend for our users, and it has successfully returned those because we are authorized. And you can also see that when we do inspect and we go to the application, and in there you can see our token right here, and because this one is valid, we can actually make this request. Now what I can do, just to check if this is working the way that we expect, I can change my token to 1234, and if I now reload this page, it will keep getting stuck on loading data, because inside of our backend it expects an authorized value, but it did not get an authorized value, it got an invalid token, and therefore we are not able to see the data. Now for the sake of checking this, we're also going to go to the register page and see if we can still make requests for the pages where authorization is not required. So following our logic that we have just written, we should be able to still make a user registration, because inside of our backend, you can see that for the register view set, everyone should be allowed to make those requests. So when we send an authorization header that is empty, it is not even going to check it, because the permissions do not require that. So for our email, we're going to do email89@email.com. And for the password, we're going to say testing321, and then we do testing321 again, like this. And now we're going to click register, and hopefully this user should now end up in our database. And we actually encounter an error here, because following our script, we currently have an invalid token. And it's completely right in saying that, because we have just changed our token in our local storage to 1234, and inside of our Axios instance we can see that it says that if a token is actually there, so the value is not blank, then we want to make the request using the token. So following that logic, it actually is correct that we cannot register any user. So what I should do is, if we have a token that is no longer valid and we notice that, we should just delete it, because it is no longer valid and it cannot be used. Okay, so I've now deleted it, and if we now register, we're actually being redirected to our login app. And if we go to our user model inside of our user interface right here, you can see that a new email address that we just created has also been added to our database. So this seems to work fine, but we need to be wary that if a token is no longer valid, we need to erase it and send the user back to the login page. And that is exactly what we're going to do, because we're going to add a new interceptor that is completely dedicated to handling these types of errors. So for now, I'm going to delete the part where we handle the error handling, because for now that is fine. But we're just going to do an Axios instance, and we're going to do .interceptors, and then .response, and then .use. And then we do some round brackets right here. And what we're now going to do is we're going to take in the response of the stuff that has just happened right here. And we're going to make some changes to that based on what we see. So we're going to start by adding something called response. And we are going to say that we want to do an arrow function. And then we do some squarely brackets where we state return the response to us. So let us know what has happened. Now, after we have received that response, we're going to make some changes based on the error that we receive. So what you just already saw is that we need to handle some of the errors in a good way, because if we have an invalid token, it can actually happen that we cannot even register any users anymore, or that we're not able to log in anymore because it jams the way that our API works. So what we should logically do right here is we should clear the token that is expired from our local storage because it has no use anymore. And in addition to that, we should also make sure that we can redirect the user to log in so that he is prompted to create a new token. So inside of error, we're first going to identify what type of error we are talking about. So we're going to do if error.response. So if we actually have an error, and that error is going to be equal to error.response.status is equal to 401, then we're going to do some actions. And this 401 error happens when our token is expired or when our token is invalid. So let's say that I've changed the local storage token to 1234. It should also do these actions because we are now being unauthorized. So in here, we can do two different things. The first thing that we're going to do is we are going to do the action of local storage dot remove item, because we want to make sure that this token value is no longer in there. So we're going to remove the item of the token in our local storage so that the invalid or the expired token is no longer there. And in addition to that, we're going to redirect the user to the login page. And to do that, we can do window.location, and then we do .href, and in there we can specify the path where we want to direct the user to. And we want the user to go to our login page, which in our case is located in the slash part. So now let's see what happens when we face this same thing again. So we are now going to go to our slash homepage, and let's see what happens right here. Yeah, you can see that we're being straight away redirected to our login page, because when it went to our homepage, it fired the API request to our backend, but our Axios instance noticed that we did not have a token, and in that case, it throws an error because we're being unauthorized, because we should not be able to make requests. And by doing that, it throws the 401, which means that we are being redirected to our login page. So that works just fine. Now, we can also try to log in now by using email@email.com, and then we can do testing 3, 2, 1, and now this should make the request. Yeah, and it has accepted our token because our token is valid according to our backend. And now we can see all of the different users right here. But let's say that we change the token. So we go to inspect and then to our application. And then we can go to our local storage. You can see that we have the token right here, which is being valid. But let's say that I am going to change this token to 1234 again. So now it is not valid again. So now when another request is fired, it should recognize that this token is invalid and that it should return us to the login page again. And it should also clear this token from our local storage. So let's press enter and see what happens. Okay, and you can now see that it had fired the API again. It erased this token from our local storage, and it has returned us to our login page because it wants us to log in and get another token, which is very nice. So by adding the interceptors to our Axios instance, we are now able to add our token to our request if it exists, or if the token does not exist, it is going to pass an empty string to our authorization headers. It is going to make the request to our backend, and based on the response that we receive, it is going to redirect the user and remove the token if the response is unauthorized. And this makes sure that if malicious requests are being made to our website, that the user is immediately returned to the login page and also cannot see any sensitive data inside of our application. Now, as a last step, we are going to re-enter the protected routes in our app.jsx file. So we're going to uncomment this so that the protected routes are active again inside of our application. And that is actually all that we needed to do for today. In the next video, we're going to continue and we're going to be focusing on password resets inside of our React.js frontend and Django backend. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please leave a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.